Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Ask Rob and Rob.
Yes, it's another Tuesday, and that can only mean one thing. Actually, it can mean lots of things depending on what you're up to, but for us, it means another episode of Ask Rob and Rob. And that means that there are two of us, and there are two people asking us questions, and we get them answered. It's a very simple concept, and it's also very simple to ask us a question. So, Rob, let people know how they can do that, and then we'll dive straight in.
Well, like there's two of us, and there's two questions. There's two ways you can do it. You can either call 013 808 00035, or you can go to thepropertyhub.net/ask. That's thepropertyhub.net/ask and leave your question there. Either way, very easy. So easy, in fact, that Tom, who was on last week, is back on again.
Hi guys, my name's Tom from Manchester. I'm new to property investment and found all your podcasts and other online tools really useful in getting me ready to take the plunge. Just about to line up a few properties, having a look at a few and just looking at the fundamentals now. Obviously, one of the key fundamentals is return on investment. I've heard you say in some of the previous podcasts that you generally only go or entertain properties with a return on investment of at least 10%. I was just wondering what you factor into that calculation. So there's obviously the main kind of capital expenses like deposit, stamp duty, furniture expenses, etc. But in terms of the ongoing costs, what else would you factor in when you're actually working out your return? So obviously there's interest payments and things like that, agent fees, but do you go down to building certificates, void periods? Just like your thoughts really, so I can make sure that we're calculating the accurate return on investment. Thanks again, and keep up the good work. Cheers.
Thank you, Tom. Bit cheeky, but that's okay. We don't mind multiple questions at all, especially when they're really good questions like this one, which a lot of other people will be thinking. So it's always good when someone asks it. It's a great question because return on investment is such an important concept, but it's also so hard to pin down because everyone does mean something slightly different by it. So I'll tell you how I approach it. Rob's answer might be slightly different. And your answer might end up being different again. The important thing, though, is to just be consistent about it so you're always comparing like with like. So personally, when it comes to ongoing expenses to factor in, interest payments, yep, those. Agent fees, I'm lucky enough not to pay them for most of my properties, thanks to Yellow Lettings. That's not free for everyone, by the way. It's just because we own it. I also factor in voids of 2 weeks per year. That's on the basis that if it's a kind of flat where people are turning over every year, then it might be empty for a couple of weeks in between. If it's a house where people will stay for longer, it might only be every couple of years, but take a bit longer to find the right tenant. So 2 weeks on average. And then I factor in an amount for maintenance. And this is the one where there's the most margin for being wrong. So when I'm working things out on paper, as a very rough rule of thumb, I tend to put like 10% of the rent for a house and 5% of the rent for a flat. The reason being, with a flat, you're also going to have a ground rent and service charge, which need to be factored in, but they're going to cover a lot of the maintenance that you'd otherwise be having to pay for. So that's how I approach it, and I make sure that I'm consistent. So whenever I'm looking at properties, I'm not kidding myself that one is better than the other. But however detailed you get, you are going to be wrong. And that's the thing. You're never really going to know what the return from a property is until you've owned it for a few years and you've seen what the maintenance actually is compared to what you've projected. So I would say, yes, capture as much as you can, but you don't have to get into endless detail of like, £60 for a gas safety check here and there, because you're going to be wrong about however much you put in as a maintenance allowance anyway. The important thing is to be consistent and then track the property once you own it to see what your true return is from the expenses you've actually had. So that's how I approach it. Rob, I'd be interested to see what assumptions you make.
I think the key point from all of that is, as Rob mentioned it twice, because it is so important, it's not what was in Rob's list, but the consistency of the list, that it doesn't change. So every time Rob assesses a property, and I do the same, every time I assess a property, I use the same factors each time. That's because it's for me and for my comparisons. So 10% was used, and yes, we've talked about that number before. We've talked about how we're open to percentages either side of it as well, much lower and much higher. However, that's based on our calculations. So you need to work them against your own. So if you do one property and you find it's 6%, it doesn't mean it's a bad investment. It might mean that you're being a lot more conservative. Or if you find it's 16%, it might be that you're being far too generous. So that is the key. That's the point. And maybe run a few different scenarios of a few different dummy deals, if you like, of your own to get an idea of what's looking strong and what isn't. Now, back to what I personally use, just for your own information. Most of those things, I include service charges, ground rents, obviously, management costs. I do actually put management costs in, even though, again, I'm fortunate because of yellow, I don't have them. But I do include them in the calculation, just so it feels like a real investment to me. I don't include maintenance costs, but that's for two reasons. One, the properties I go for are new or nearly new, so they need very, very little maintenance in the short to medium term. Doesn't mean they won't have any. Of course, there are exceptions, but the majority of the time, I get a smooth running from that point of view. However, what I do to compensate that is the mortgage rate I use. I play a very conservative game and work on 4%. Even though the mortgage products I look at are, 25%, even more lower, which makes a big difference to the numbers, I use that consistency, and again, this is important, that consistency of my mortgage rate every single time. So I don't go, right, this month I'll use 3.5, or this month I'll use 3%, because mortgage rates are dipping. I'm sticking to the 4% every time, so I get a true comparison against previous investments I've looked at. So definitely get loads of stuff down. Don't be too generous, but consistency is the key here. I think that's the big takeaway.
Definitely. So thank you for asking that, because I think we got into some really useful stuff there. Now, let's turn to a question from Tony.
Hi, Rob. It's Tony here. Great show, great podcast. Loving all your free information. I have a property that I rent out. It's leasehold. It's a one-bed flat. I've been hearing a lot about service accommodation. I pay the freeholder annual fee of $750 per year to rent out my property. Is there any way I could change my property into a service accommodation, or would I have to ask the freeholder? Thank you. Bye.
I think this is going to be a short one, Rob, because this is pretty much a yes or no answer. But it's a really good question, because a lot of people are looking at serviced accommodation now. For those who don't know what serviced accommodation is, it's letting your property out on short lets, possibly using Airbnb as an example. Now, this is something I've personally looked at. For those who haven't picked it up in my accent yet, I am from Liverpool, and I live in the southeast. Now, of course, Liverpool being the greatest city in the world, I like to travel back there quite frequently and take my family as well. So I've been on the lookout for a property in the city centre that I could use for myself from time to time, but because I'm an investor and I don't want a property sitting there empty, because that's quite an expensive extravagance, I want to let it out when I'm not using it. So the Airbnb model, the serviced accommodation model. That's what I wanted to do. And I found a property that was perfect from a price point of view, a location point of view. It ticked all the boxes. Not only would it be great for me and my family, but it'd be great for people who wanted to stay in the city. I viewed the property. I was super keen until I got hold of the legal pack. And in the legal pack, I found out the lease restricted people from letting the properties out on short-term lets. Now, I could have been a bit cheeky and done it anyway, because I know some people do. But obviously, I wouldn't do that and ever advocate that, but I know some people do. But if I was that way inclined, I would have been doubly restricted, because this particular property had concierge, which would make it more difficult to operate, because the concierge would see what's going on, people going in and out, and it would put my model at risk. If there was no concierge, I may, if I was that way inclined, have considered it and took the gamble and gone about it that way. Of course, I'm not advocating that in any shape or form, but I know plenty of people do. So the quick answer is, do you need to check? Yes. May you need to pay a fee? Possibly, but you may not be able to whatsoever. So you need to check, do the checks, and then you'll get the answer that way. And then what you do next is up to you.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that you'll need to think about, you don't mention whether or not you've got a mortgage on that property, but your mortgage may or may not, probably not, in fact, allow you to do short-term accommodation. So you'd probably need to switch your mortgage to a product that did allow you to do that if you wanted to go down that route. So serviced accommodation, it's very popular. It's popular for a reason because it can be very profitable, but there are these barriers to doing it properly. And this is actually a subject that we're getting into in the next issue of the Property Hub magazine, which is out in just a few weeks' time. There's a whole feature about short-term lets and especially the mortgage implications of those, the products that are available, what you need to do, what you need to check, and so on. So if you're subscribed to the Property Hub magazine, well done you. You can just sit back and wait for that to drop through your letterbox anytime soon. If not, then you need to move quickly. You need to get over to thepropertyhub.net/magazine, sign up there, £5 a quarter, as well as getting the subscription for all future issues. As soon as you sign up, you'll get digital access to all back issues. So go and sign up now. And then while you wait for that first issue to come through, you can go back and have a read of the last couple of years worth as well. So for £5 a quarter, I think that is an investment well worth making this year.
It certainly is. Another investment worth making this year is giving your ears the joy of the Property Podcast, which is back on Thursday. So make sure you join us for that. And of course, we'll be back with Ask Rob and Rob next Tuesday. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.